Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Empowered Self podcast with me, Krystal Long. And today's episode will feel like coming home and sitting by a fire with a good friend. I'm joined today by my dear friend, Maria Gillen, who is a storyteller and who has carried the ancient art of Irish storytelling all around the world. And Maria doesn't just tell stories, she shares pieces of our heritage and brings them to life wherever she goes. In this light-hearted and reflective chat, with plenty of laughter and even one of Maria's stories to enjoy. So Maria, you're very welcome.
Oh, well, it's so lovely to be here with you, Krystal. And how many times have we sat in a room together and enjoyed one another's company? So it just does feel like coming home to the heart, you know?
It does indeed. And, as you said, you and I have had so many chats over the years, and I'm really excited today because listeners get to join us in one of our conversations. So we'll start a bit late, Maria. First of all, what's the very first story you remember ever falling in love with? And what was it about storytelling that pulled you in? Was there a moment when you thought, this isn't just entertainment, this is what I want to share with the world?
Well, I suppose we've talked about this a lot in the past because you have a fairly hefty storytelling house yourself. You had some amazing people come and tell you stories over the years. And I was lucky to grow up in Mayfield on the north side of Cork City, and it was full of stories. And my mother was a storyteller, and my granny from Granabraher Road was a
Yeah.
storyteller, and my great grandmother who lived at the foot of the Slieve Blue Mountains. So when it comes to stories from my memory, I have an embarrassment of wealth of stories. And I suppose one of the ones that's up for me at the moment is the story I heard from my great grandmother, because she was born in 1879. Imagine, to such a slow world. There was not even radios around in those days to mark out your day. So there was no tech. Imagine it. It was such a different life. And I remember her telling me a story about nettles and how nettles were A to zinc, that they had every nourishing thing in them that you need to sustain a body. And I'm wondering, with Baden Fassa information like that, if everybody had known that, would we have had a very different outcome to the famine? And, she would have come in the generation after the famine. And did she pick this information up after the fact? Those are questions that I still ask myself. So yeah, so that was one of the stories. And then I remember my granny and gran telling me that when they got their house in Gran, they used to put a light on in the landing. And if you put a light on in two places in the upstairs, everything went off and a fuse would blow. And they were very cognizant of cost. So they didn't want anything to blow because they'd have to buy a new fuse then. So she would turn the light on in the landing for a certain amount of time, and the light would flow into her son's room on one side and my mom's room, which was the girls' room, on the other side. And then when she'd be ready for bed herself, she'd tell them a story. And for me, it was my first guided meditation because it was full of the flowers of an Irish garden. And as you close your eyes and as she told you the story, and as her words got slower, and as the images got more golden, you were pulled into this world in between waking and sleeping. What a beautiful way to go to sleep. So yeah, so there's loads there. And then my mother's stories, we'd be here for another 3 hours, Krystal, so I won't start on those ones.
And when was there a moment that you thought this was more than entertainment, that is something that you wanted to share with the world?
um So just to come back to that question, are you looking for an entertainment or something that would be, for me, stories hits an awful lot of levels, and I call it the person's diamond. So I call it their pile's diamond: physical, intellectual, language, emotional, social, and spiritual. And I suppose for me, there's 5 deep wells of storytelling. There's the myths and the legends that we're all so in love with, and we're falling more in love with them now, which is great. Since COVID, it seems to have awoken our ancient memory. Then there's the stories of our stones. And for me, mostly in Cork, because that's where I grew up. Although I have a few stories from Kerry now, because I'm the storyteller in residence in Finoog, in Sheehan's 300-year-old storytelling cottage. So that would be stories of our stones. Then you have the diaspora stories, such important stories that came back to us across the sea from people who might have had to leave against their will. And then there is the Banfassa stories, which fascinate me. So these are the stories where all our wisdom lies. And in a culture where it was illegal to be educated for 800 years, where do you put your wisdom? Only into your songs and your stories, your poetry and your music, you know? And then finally, there's the co-created stories. And you would have seen me do this, Krystal, where I pull threads from an audience and I weave it together in real time. And this story coalesces between us. So I love all of those stories. So what kind of story would you like?
I suppose, first of all, I was just kind of getting the angle of how you went around the world with the stories, how you
Yeah.
left your previous life in corporate to actually take the story on the road.
Yes, exactly. Well, I suppose in 2007, I came to the end of my corporate road, and I had been in the corporate environment for 22 years. And for 4 of those years, I was at the top of my game. I was the European operations manager with a company called Amdocs, and we were having incredible success. We'd gone from 70% turnover of staff to 0%. And we had done this through using storytelling techniques. So I had begun looking at things like emotional intelligence, the power of now, the 7 habits of successful people, and many more. All you're nodding your head away there because they're books that are still very applicable. But as I was going through them, all I was hearing in my head was my mother's voice saying, "Common sense, girl, sure that's common sense." Or my great grandmother saying to me, "Step outside yourself and take a look in now. Take pause and have a look at that." And I was applying what they said from what I was reading in these books. And we spent 2 days a year. That's 4 hours per quarter on the business instead of in the business. And in those 4 hours, we made it such a wonderful environment to work in that nobody left our team. We had 0% turnover of staff, and I held that for the 4 years that I was at the helm, and a lot of that was story wisdom. But by the end of it, Krystal, I was after falling in love with stories again. I was after waking up to the wisdom of them. I was after rediscovering that I had something outside of my intellect, that I had a physical body, that I had a heart, a beating heart, that I had a soul, that I had a stomach that told me things, so I relied on my gut, and I suppose I would have grown up in Mayfield and I would have relied on my gut a lot growing up. You learnt those things. And I remember becoming fascinated in the Idir. So in the Irish language, there is a word called Idir, and it just covers so much. It means the in between, or in English, we'd say the liminal space. And so I discovered that when people heard you, they heard 20% of the words that you were saying, but the other 80% was what they were intuiting about how you said something or the speed at which you said it. Because we like to get a lie out fast, but we might take our time over truthful things. We might think about them as we're talking. We might pause a little bit more. So I'd fallen down the rabbit hole and I'd gone back to college in those 4 years. I'd become a biodynamic psychotherapist and I wasn't finished yet. I wanted to know what was story's place in therapy. And I found dramatherapy, and I did my MA in dramatherapy with a very heavy leaning on the medicinal story, the healing story. And in fact, I became a silversmith so that I could make my little, my little amulet, which says Skyholders lice, and it has the storyteller's stone, which is labradorite, which is supposed to have the property of being able to coalesce on the idder, on the in between, when you're talking to an audience. So it was very exciting. It really woke me up, and I gave up all of the um, trappings, or they used to call them that golden handcuffs. So I no longer had, my medical insurance. I no longer had pension. I no longer knew how much money was going to be coming in at the end of every month. And I had a very tough few years. When I first set up as a therapist, my books were completely full. That was in Dublin. But I had this yearning to come back to Cork. And that was a tough landing because I was like a ghost in my own town. Who knew me after being away for so long? And the answer is nobody. It was very difficult to get work. And I remember retraining and spending some time in the sexual health centre, almost 3 years there, getting to know people again, getting to love Cork again, getting involved in things like playback theatre, which I loved and still love. So I'm still in contact with the people that I would have met every week, and they became my supports and my expression, as I built up my, uh, to finding the places to tell stories. Where do you tell stories now? You can't just go down to Patrick Street and say, do you want to hear a story? Well, you can, but then people will say to you, yeah, and I have one for you too, you know. Um, so I found fantastic clubs. I found the Gab and Mary Walsh, and that's still going strong. I found the Cork Yarn Spinners, and that's a great route into Cork storytelling for me. I found that I got a good bit of work in companies like Johnson Control, even UCC, consulting on the mechanisms of stories. But I got my first real taste of being a full time storyteller when COVID came. And I was asked by Kerry Writers Museum to start a storytelling circle, and it mushroomed. People were starving for stories. And the great thing about bringing it online was I had people from Kerry, from Cork, from Limerick coming into these storytelling circles. And we actually won an award during those crazy, weird times. Our award was the Beothana Hero Award for collecting memories and connecting people through the story road, through mining the memories and making new stories. And the great gift of that was there was a lot of transition year students that didn't have an awful lot of opportunity during those strange times. So what they did was they prepared bits of technology. Maybe somebody had a phone, or maybe somebody had a computer, but they only wanted to press one button. So the lads would put a link on the phone or a link on the computer, and then the elders only had to press one button, and they knew that 2 o'clock on a Tuesday the room would open, much like the room has opened here today, and that our story circle would begin. So that was the start of things. And since then, I've been to Nova Scotia this year. I'm just back. I've been to France, to Croatia. I teach story making in Germany every year, going back for my 6th year this year. And of course, I'm in very close contact with Marrakesh, and we set the Guinness World Record for the longest ever storytelling session in Elfana Square this February. So yeah, so it's really taken off, Krystal.
Wow, what a journey, Maria. And,
Yeah.
with those stories going to places like Marrakesh and Nova Scotia, do those tales land differently when they're abroad, or do people get the Irish nuances to those stories?
Well, people love the Irish nuance. We're almost expected to be great storytellers, and I think it is very much part of our culture still. We're very lucky with that. And even when I was European Ops Manager, it was always the Irish office was expected to start the sing song, and that was a currency in itself. But what I'm finding is that I love meeting with other nations and their love of story. For example, when I was in Nova Scotia, I met storytellers from all over Canada, and they held the threads to their seeding in Canada very dear. So I met the Irish Common in Nova Scotia, and the stories they were able to tell me, and their accents were amazing. It was like they'd just arrived out of Ireland, So I suppose when you're displaced from your own country, you become even more um, aligned with the nature of that country. And so it is for a lot of the Irish descendants in Canada. But I also had the great pleasure of meeting the Mi'kmaq people, the First Nations people. And there's a man there called Raymond Sewell, and he was actually on my radio show today, my Cork City Community Radio show, which is dedicated to stories every Monday between 2 and 3. And I had the great honour, the great privilege of telling the story of the Choctaw gift to Ireland when I was there on First Nations Day. And they were very moved by this because there isn't an awful lot of good news stories about what would have happened in the past 200, 300, 400 years in terms of how the borders of the world has shifted and how different traditions were pushed down and other traditions were overstated, and all of that is held in our stories. So that's been amazing.
And what do you think makes Irish storytelling so timeless? What gives it the magic that people love hearing it, even abroad?
Um, I think a lot of it is to do with how we tell stories and our connection to the Irish session. And to me, a good session is like a beautiful Irish tea cake. You don't know what you're going to get in the next bite. You can have music and stories and poetry and joke telling and even a bit of dancing at an Irish session. And how people come in is amazing because it's silent. They have a tradition in an Irish session. If you're part of a community that tells stories and they live out their session, then as you're coming in the door, the Faratee will give you a barely perceptible nod or a slight blink of the eye. And if you make longer than normal eye contact with them, or if you give an imperceptible nod of the head back, you will be asked for a story or a song in that session. And they have this thing called get in on the gap, which is a rhythm of coming in. So if you can imagine, Krystal, and you don't have to imagine very far because you've been at these sessions, but you can imagine if somebody sang a gut-wrenching Shanno song that was a grief song full of sorrow, you have to wait for 3 heartbeats before you can come in with a rip-roaring story. And they call that the clearing. So that's kind of bred into us. And you think that everybody else knows about this. But if you live in a world that doesn't have this kind of storytelling rhythm, you might come in too fast and you might not give that pause, the power of the pregnant pause. You might not give that 3 seconds, that 3 heartbeats for the atmosphere to change. So in that session, you can have a complete topography of emotion. It can take you away. And in that, you can have amazing catharsis. But you need to know the rhythms and you need to know what works and what doesn't work. And it's not something you can learn in a classroom. That you learn by experience.
Absolutely. And, Maria, we could talk about stories all
All
day
day long.
long and into all hours of the morning.
Yeah.
Um, But I think our listeners would love to experience the magic for themselves. Would you gift us a story today? One, I suppose, that carries some of the ancient wisdom and that you found resonates wherever you bring. And that will give us a kind of a flavour of how to experience and really enjoy the art of
Yeah,
storytelling.
I'd be deeply honoured to do that. And I suppose the story that's coming to me, because we spoke of it, is the Choctaw story. Would it be okay if I told that one?
Absolutely, work away.
Great. Okay. So it was the year 1878, and the famine was biting down on the shoulder of Era herself. These people, Krystal, our people, who had been great poets and singers and storytellers, who had been fantastic sportsmen and women, who in the dark ages of Europe produced beautiful works like the Book of Kells, with great artistry and great erudite thoughts in them. Well, these people had been put down and they had been kept down for almost 800 years. And now, adding insult to injury, it was said that there was a famine in Ireland, the potato famine. But if you look out our windows, Krystal, if you travel in a car through Ireland, you will know that we are known as the green country for a reason. There was plenty of food growing here, but it went under armed guard out of the ports of Ireland, including our own port in Cove. And so the people had to make tough decisions. They had to make hard decisions. One family making decisions like this were the O'Brien clan in Ventry in County Kerry. Mr. O'Brien, he gathered his big family around the scrubbed, empty table. Empty because there was no food to put on that table. And he announced that he had saved his pennies and that the young and healthy branch of the family would leave this place, would go across the sea to the new world in the hopes of getting work there, of sending money home to bring out the next branch of the family. Mrs. O'Brien, who never had a harsh word to say to her husband in 40 years of marriage, now put her knuckles on the table where they turned white with temper as she pulled herself to her full height. She looked at him with the gimlet eye. "Are you telling me," she said, "are you telling me that you're sending my children away from here? What then will we have to live for?" "They're my children too," he said, "and I am sending them so that they will have a chance at life." She would not talk to him. She would not lie with him. She would not feed him, but it took no talk on him because he knew that he had to hold the line in order to give his children a chance. The neighbours came in then for the Irish wake, for the session that we were talking about. They called it the American wake in those days because they knew that they would probably never see the face of these children again. And so they told the old stories. They sang the old songs. They told of our traditions and our myths. They put blessings on the heads of the children, and those that could afford it gave money so that they would make a good start in the new world. They rolled this up and they sewed it into a pocket on the inside of their vest so that it wouldn't be lost in the journey. On the day they set out, the sky was grey and it began to rain as if the sky herself was crying on these children of Era. As they walked along the old butter roads with that ironic name, they had to sleep under hedges or in wide open fields, and sometimes, if a farmer was soft hearted, he let them burrow into the middle of a hayrick so that they might have one dry night before reaching Cork City. And when they arrived, even though they were weary, they celebrated until they realised they had 25 miles more to go to get to Cove of Cork, and our deepest harbour, the deepest in the then known world. Oh, it's well we can imagine what the mothers said to their children as they threw their shawls around the thin shoulders of their offspring. Never forget, never forget where you came from. Tell our stories, sing our songs, and for God's sake, will you say your prayers that you might reach the other place safely? Mr. O'Brien couldn't bear to watch it. Something in his stomach tightened. Something around his heart broke. He turned then and he walked up the bluffs of Cove, looking on the sea now from a great distance. And there in Antiangan Driachta, in the ancient magical language of Irish, he began to call out to the elements. Anamara, soul of the sea, Spriad on spare, spirit of the sky, God Naguiha, voice of the wind, Kauri and Ling, help us, Ta Okras and Down Oring, the hunger of the world is upon us, Okrasim Volok, Okrasim Cree, Okrasim Crown, Okrasim Anum. There is a terrible hunger in my stomach, in my heart, in my mind, in my soul. Crush 'em! Listen to me. Kauriogling, help us. It was as if the elements listened to him, for the sky began to darken and the clouds began to thicken. The sea began to rise and the waves began to boil. The wind began to rise, not to drown out his words, you understand, but to collect them, to fashion them into a tune that would follow the beating hearts of his children across the sea. And so they made their way up the gangplank onto the coffin ships, feet on either side of their young faces as they lay in the hammocks, cheek by jowl. And there they faced one another. They faced oncomers. They faced pestilence and bad weather. And through it all, deep in the belly of the wind, they heard that ancient tune from the old country. La, 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 la. And it was just enough. It was just enough to keep them going. Just enough to give them that heart lift. Just enough to pull their spirits up until they reached New York Harbour and the Statue of Liberty with her great symbol of hope up over the harbour. The children of Eire disgorged from the ship. It wasn't long before they got work. It wasn't long before they got good food and their cheeks began to fill out and their Irish eyes, they smiled once more. And they brought our songs and our stories and our traditions to a new shore. And the breeze took her leave of the children of Eire. She found her way on the top of an aspen tree, and there she sang the ancient song one last time. Ta Krysaring, Krysandawin, Kaurian, Kaurian Ling. And deep at the base of the aspen tree, Grandfather Choctaw was poking at the red embers of the fire. And as he poked, he listened to this strange tune in the new wind that was coming across the sea from the old countries. And he thought to himself, that is a strange tune. That is a sorrowful tune. I wonder, what can it mean? And in a culture like ours that knows what it is to listen to dreams, he took all of those experiences into the longhouse. He pulled up one of the handmade blankets of his people and he went to that place that needs no language, to the place of deep sleep. And through the mist of sleeps stepped forward two braves, and between them an emaciated figure whose cheeks had fallen in and were hollow, whose eyes rolled back in their head, whose teeth rattled in their mouth. And even though no language was needed, that entity let it be known that they were starving in Ireland, starving in their stomachs, starving in their heart, starving in their mind, starving in their soul. But more than this, as the world watched, as the world listened, it seemed that nobody could hear them, nobody could see them, nobody came to help. Would you help us? The entity seemed to be asking, help us. And he stepped back into the mist of sleep as Grandfather Choctaw came up through the layers. And when he finally woke up, he called his people around him. He told them of his dream vision, and they said, Grandfather, we are 14 years off of the trail of tears. Our hearts are broken. Our backs are bent. Our spirits bear the mark. What do you want us to do? And Grandfather Choctaw said, we bear the privilege and the responsibility of elegance of spirit. History is a big book and we are but a blink in that book, and the world is waiting. The world is watching. We need to help these Irish people. And they said, Grandfather, that man on the horse, he kicked Grandma in the shoulders, for she was not moving fast enough. And that man with the big stick, he has frightened our children into silence. Are these the people that you want us to help? Grandfather Choctaw took a deep breath. Then he looked into the eyes of each one of his people, the windows to the soul, and he asked them this question. Are you telling me that we must not treat these people any differently from the way that we have been treated? Can we then call ourselves different? If we treat these people the same way that we have been treated, are we not then the same? His people heard the weight and the truth in his words. They took work then with the railways of America. They gathered every cent for 3 months. And at the end of 3 months, they had that money in a receptacle. They decided not to send the money to the people of Ireland, for it would go into the pocket of Lord Trevelyan. How wise they were. Instead, they decided that the Irish people needed a golden symbol. So they hired a ship and they filled it from the hull to the very top with golden corn. And this golden symbol came into Cove of Cork, not many miles from where I'm sitting now, and from there to the Weybridge in Mallow, and from Mallow to every county in Ireland, north and south, and it still flies in our fields today. And it was a turning point, for it gave the Irish people hope. Docus, hope, and we never forgot. We call them Clan Ceanna, the same family. Clan Ceanna, kindred spirits, for we are more the same than we are different. Shine Mushkale, that is my story.
Maria, that was gorgeous. Thank you
Thank
for
you,
that.
Krystal.
And as you said earlier, you get meditation journey from listening to stories, and I can just picture myself on that journey and the visuals it was given me. And that's such a very important story for us people in Cork. And you and I know the sculpture down in East Cork, the kindred spirits, which is it 6 feathers, shaped feathers on that sculpture. And then, as if I remember correctly, last year the Choctaw tribes created another sculpture.
Yeah,
It's a heart with the Celtic Trinity knot.
that's right.
Um,
And they faced it towards Ireland. Yeah. So our bonds are getting deeper.
yeah,
And when I told that story, Tim Tingle from the Choctaw Nation, he heard it because for the first time, traditional tellers had gone online, which was the silver lining to the COVID cloud for us. And when he heard that story, he decided that he would come to Cork. So he was coming to a storytelling festival in Bray called the Yarn Festival, which is absolutely fantastic. I love yarn. And I got on to their artistic director, Aoife Demel, and I said, Aoife, can I kidnap him for 2 days? And then I had to get on to him, and I said, will you stay 2 days longer? And he said, I'd love to. And I brought him all around Cork, and we cried in Cove, looking out where the Titanic went down and the Lusitania, and where the gift from the Choctaw came in. And he stood in the kindred spirit sculptures, and he sang a Choctaw song, and it was so moving. And everywhere we went, we had hundreds of Cork people in our wake going, oh my God, is this a Choctaw storyteller? And the stories he told us of the Trail of Tears were just incredible. So stories are such a weaving. They weave people together, and they weave us together across time. And they remind us of resilient stories when we really need a little bit of resilience.
and it was such a dreadful period in history as well. 47, if I remember correctly, was Black 47.
That's right.
Was at the height of the famine when millions were dying.
Mm, yeah. And then in my great grandmother's time, they had the Spanish flu, mumps and measles. They were they were the next great big killers, you know. So they didn't have the technology that we have today. And it was a tough time. Like the people think that it ended with the famine, but it didn't. There was a huge period of recovery, and it was painful, slow recovery, and that's in our stories.
And it's an amazing story. It really symbolizes the friendship and the connection of between two nations during the most horrendous time in history. But
Yeah.
have you shared that story abroad?
Yeah. So when I went to Nova Scotia, I was supposed to be telling Shannon Sheila, and I was telling on First Nations Day, and I was the only white person telling that evening, and I went, oh my God, I need to tell the Choctaw story. So I stood in front of the microphone and I said, I'm going to step away from what's in the program. And they went, oh, you know. And then I told that story, and people really loved it and were unaware of it in that part of the world. But I also have told it at festivals in the UK, and they're only beginning to realise about the famine now. They knew there was a rivalry between Ireland and the UK, but they didn't know the root of it. So it comes out in our stories. And they themselves love that story because ordinary working class British people were also not having a good time during those times. And the famine wasn't just the potato famine didn't just hit Ireland. It hit a lot of European countries, but we were the ones that were isolated and didn't get help until we got um, seen by the Choctaw people, and then more help came in.
It's a great reminder, isn't it? Even in history, when times were tough here in Ireland, there were other nations coming to our help.
Yes.
And it's
Yeah.
great to see, even centuries on, we're still helping other countries with humanitarian aid. And
Yeah. But it's in our DNA, it's in our memory, So I think that's a lot of why we do come. And I suppose one of the wonderful things that happened in the COVID times as well was that the Navajo people got into trouble. That wasn't the wonderful thing. The wonderful thing was that they put a cry into the internet. Can anybody see us? Can anybody hear us? And that touched the hearts of the Irish people because of this story, that is in the cells of our bodies. So within a week, they had raised $4 million from Ireland alone. And that was $1 for every soul lost to Éire in the Gortamore. Isn't that amazing? I mean, look at the symbology of that. And that wasn't planned. That was just a rising to the cry and and they couldn't figure it out. So the Navajo people were going, why is this coming in from Ireland? And then their Choctaw brothers were saying, this is why. So then the story went out through the Navajo Nation, which was wonderful because it's a story we should be spreading. It's a story we should be telling.
Yeah, and I find like with storytelling, it really does deepen the connection between people.
Yeah, it does. That's why it's called weaving, Krystal. A
Yeah.
story weaving, And that's why I love the co-created stories, because if you look at the world from space, you don't see any borders. Borders are a man-made thing. So now that I've been in the square in El Fana, which is a real surging of humanity from everywhere, there was 100 storytellers from all over the world this year at the festival, from every country and every corner. And as you're making the stories together, as you're pulling a thread from this one and this one, you make this fantastic story. But then who does it belong to? It's not an Irish story. It's not a French story. It's not a Canadian story. It's a story that's come up between us, So story weaving has never been more important in terms of communication and in terms of getting out of your head and into your heart and into your common sense and into your gut, So, yeah.
I remember storytelling used to start at a very young age, when you were going to bed in the evening time and
Yeah.
the books were brought out and you'll have your granny or your parents reading you a story to put to sleep. Sometimes I think that art is kind of lost in this
It
day and
it
age.
is and it isn't. Like I love going down to Fanoog because they've never lost it, and the kids come in the arms of their parents, and I have tried to get that going in Cork again, but what we don't have is a story home. So I'm constantly campaigning for a story house in Cork City, where you can come in at any age, all across the generations, because stories doesn't see age. Do you remember sitting under the table listening to the stories you weren't supposed to listen to, Krystal, under your granny's table in Gran? They were
Yeah.
the best stories. Yeah.
And you'd be given out to for earwigging.
That's it. When they caught you, you have to be very good at not getting caught. But you'd give yourself away then because you'd have information you shouldn't have.
No.
Or I used to love Bonfire Night in Mayfield, because the mams would all save the 5 penny pieces, and then they'd buy minerals. Remember minerals, Krystal? Coke and Tanora and
Yeah.
7 Up. And then
Corn
they'd put
cob
the
tenora.
exactly, and then they'd put the thing that the minerals were carted around in, the crate. They'd put that upside down, and they'd have a seat, and they'd sit down, they'd cross their arms, and you'd gather in, and the fire would have been, like, it could be around midnight, and the fire is after kind of going down to a red glow, and then the ghost stories came out, Krystal. And you'd be terrified, and you'd be lamping onto your mum on the way home. You'd be kind of
Along
dug
with the
out of it.
banshees.
Yeah, exactly. But it was a great way of keeping the kids together. I remember when Ireland's grid came under pressure when I was a child, and they'd just turn all the electricity at 6 o'clock in the evening. So they'd allow the mums to cook the dinners and stuff like that, and then the whole country would go dark. You won't remember this now, Krystal. You're not old enough. But when we come home, then my mother would get a candle and she'd stick it into a jam jar of dirt, and she'd look at us and she'd say, if you stay inside the light of the candle, you'll be fine. But if you go into the shadows, I can't be responsible. And she didn't have to say anything else. Like, she didn't have to, because we'd scare ourselves. Even if we wanted to go to the bathroom, there'd be three of you going together with the one candle. So it was a great way of keeping us safe without, kind of giving us the pointy finger and saying, you need to
Yeah.
do this or you need to do that. There's just no way we'd have gone off into the shadows.
On that note, I suppose let's imagine for a moment, Maria, if you and I were both characters in an Irish folktale, what would you be? I'm really hoping I'm not the poor one that gets turned into a swan for 900 years.
I know. I'll tell you. Well, I think at the moment I'd be the crone. I'm kind of really loving the crone. You know, um the one that carved out Ireland. I'm struggling for her name now, which I shouldn't be, but because she lives for thousands of years, you know, and she can shapeshift. So she's a fierce, powerful one altogether, you know. Bera, it's Bera, the Haga Bera, you know. And she's really in the hearts and the minds of the Cork people. So I love Bera. And Bera is hugely important in Scotland as well. So it's a great connection when you're telling stories over. But I'm always saying, but the Haggabera in her stone form is down across from Bear Island, you know, Cape Clear, Bear Island. And they're like, oh my God, you know, but she made Scotland. I said, she made Cork too. I said, we just share her. So we share that one with the Celtic cousins. So I think that's who I would like to be. What about you, Krista? Who would you like to be?
Um, I suppose for me, like I grew up with the stories of Tír na Nog,
Yeah.
and for me it would be Niamh.
Oh, I like
Um,
Niamh. Yeah.
Niamh, is it Kinor or something?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Niamh and Cian Orr, which means
yeah,
the
golden,
blondie hair. Yeah. You
yeah, the
know,
golden hair.
I tell that story. I've told it on Cork City Community Radio. But she was also one of the Sidhe. So those people, they live a different time scale to us. So she's still alive out there. She's still on Tiernan Og, looking through the mists, the Kyo the magical mist,
Yeah,
looking for her love, like, you know. So yeah.
yeah. Wasn't her love Oisin? Oisin, yeah.
Yeah, he
She's
was
to
he was
Maori.
half. His mum was Fia, so his mum was the deer, and she lived on Tiernan Og. And when she'd be running her fingers across the inch of water that she'd taken from his home place, so that she could see her son, then Neve's little head would come over her shoulder, going, "Who's he?" And she fell in love with him by degrees. So she thought he was a cheeky and funny fellow when they were both young. Then she thought he was really good at sports. Then she saw how kind he was as a leader. And then there was the day that she turned around and she said to Fia, I think I love him. And Fia's heart leapt because she really loved Niamh as well.
Yeah,
So if he hadn't decided to go back to Éire, we all have that. I remember leaving Ireland and I was gone for, you know, kind of for a little while. I was gone to the UK. And I remember thinking, I have to go home. I have to go home. It was the first thought in my head every day. So I think there is a yearning
yeah,
to come home to the home country for anyone who's had to leave their place, you know.
yeah. And for a lot of people, they didn't leave because they want to. They had no choice.
Yeah. I know it's going on for other people, you know. It's
Yeah.
different if you leave for fun or for advancement, you know. So, yeah. So the stories are magical and mystical and practical and logical and shapeshiftery.
And I think that's the wonderful thing about Irish diaspora. Those stories carry
Yeah.
through generations in different countries.
Yeah. It's so lovely to see the recognition on people's faces when you tell a Naaman Kelly story or an ancient myth, you know, or a bit of wisdom from
Yeah.
your mum. Like, you know, people love the food stories, you know, long ago when we had porridge, you know, and they'd be like, oh, the porridge, you know.
I remember one time being told that there was a lady in Cork. Her son had emigrated to America
Yeah,
and she can't read or write. So he used to send letters home to her, but the local priest used to come up and read the
yeah.
letters, but he normally sent a package with the letters.
Oh, I know the story. That's an Eilish de Barra story. Yeah,
Exactly. And he normally sends over flour and fabric and a few bits and pieces. And she used to always make brown bread, or soul bread, I think it was, in the kitchen. And the priest came over one Sunday after Mass when she was cooking, and she said the letter is there, would you mind reading out to me? But it turned out the flower was actually her son's ashes. He had passed away. God love him, in America, and here she was baking him into the making
Yeah.
bread dough out of it, like, you know.
Yeah. And apparently, kind of that cake tin is buried out in Kilcully somewhere.
Yeah.
Great stories. Couldn't you just talk stories all day long, Krystal?
We could do if we had the time.
We need a story house. We
Oh,
definitely do.
we definitely do, because there's more stories definitely from you to come anyway.
Definitely. Can't
Especially,
wait for our next time.
yeah, especially after gathering so many from around the world as well, from different cultures.
Yeah, that's it.
Um, and if someone listening today, Maria, feels a little lost or disconnected, what story or piece of storytelling wisdom would you place in their pocket to carry with them?
There's so many. We have a shanuckle for everything. We have but the ones that I love the most are the ones that I've gathered from the elders in Cork. And one of the stories is called the Sure What About It? You know, because if you say to yourself, sure, what about it? You then give yourself space to go, it's going to get better. So people in their day, I mean, if you can imagine what the people had to live through in past times, like the two world wars, like the famine, and they'd be feeling the devastation, and then they'd say to themselves, sure, what about it? And it would give them a little bit of space to know it's going to get better. And I have a beautiful story called the Sure What About It that's up on Cork City Community Radio. So you can hear all those stories on www.cr.ie/Shanachie. That's where you'll get those stories.
Thanks for that, Maria. And I look forward to listening to those stories as well on Cork Radio as well.
Thanks, Krystal.
Because, like you, I too love a good story.
Yeah.
And Maria, to close, will you finish this sentence for us? The magic of storytelling is.
The magic of storytelling is much too big for language. It sits in the soul, it stretches into your heart, it tickles its way out through your throat, and it connects you with the people around you and with times past and way into the future. In stories, all things are possible.
And with that, stories have a way of holding us steady. They remind us we're part of something much older, much bigger, and much more beautiful than ourselves. Uh, Maria, thank you so much for bringing us back to that magic today and for gifting us not only your friendship but also your wisdom.
Fáilte, Macara. You're welcome, welcome, my good friend. Mwah.
And for those listening, you may carry a story with you this week, whether it's one from childhood, one you've just heard, or one that's waiting to be told. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you next time on the Empowered Self podcast. Thanks a million, Maria. It was a pleasure.
Lovely being here.